Hi, Joanna. So, what is and was degrowth?
Degrowth, it's basically a call for a transformation of society where you have an equitable downscaling of production and consumption. Degrowth is essentially trying to go beyond this and work out how you would have this macroeconomic shift in the economy supported by redistributive measures, basically creating social justice at the same time as ecological justice.
What does the degrowth world look like?
In terms of what society looks like now in a kind of degrowth world, we can kind of think about it as a result of a process where some things have been reduced and contracted and some things have been expanded. So kind of prior to this transformation, a lot of people thought that degrowth meant kind of stopping certain things or ending certain arrangements. And this is true for some aspects of society. And the challenge really has been to figure out what sorts of technologies we want to keep to kind of maintain our society and which ones are just too socially and ecologically detrimental.
That's interesting. Where are we now?
In terms of kind of everyday arrangements and how everyday life looks, it's basically the result of both bottom-up and top-down processes that all kind of work together to end what we kind of think of as the artificial scarcity that capitalism basically created.
And how did people's life change?
People have a lot more free time. There's been working time reductions where you have to work less during the week for the same amount of money. There's also something which is similar to universal basic income, but it's called minimum income. This means that people have the financial support that they need to basically do what they want with their lives. In addition to this, there's things like universal basic services, so kind of creating different public goods and de-enclosing things that capitalism had cut off from people to basically ensure that you have access to everything you need to live a good life.
And what are the new social arrangements?
There are different kind of forms of social arrangements that have been emerging, so co-housing, cooperatives, different forms of currency, kind of non-monetary currency or local currencies, things like time banking where you give your time in exchange for someone else's time. And there's also been a kind of expansion of what you would basically call the kind of green and care economy. So people have been able to leave jobs that were ecologically destructive and now can kind of spend their time maybe restoring an ecosystem, caring for elderly people, teaching, creating art, and so on.
Joanna, is everything local now?
A lot of kind of top-down things going on, so it's not all kind of happening at this local level, and this is really to kind of fix the ills that capitalism has essentially created in the past. So in addition to something like minimum income, you also have maximum income, so there's a lot of effort to not just to do degrowth but de-accumulation. What we wanted to do was to ensure that there wasn't wealth being concentrated in the hands of an elite. So there's strong taxes on wealth, on income, on inheritance, and so on. And then there's also been some kind of efforts to focus maybe more on things like geoengineering, or even from the leftist side to look at things like kind of creating freedom and post-scarcity through full automation. But there has been a shift where everything that we try to do is within social and ecological limits. So instead of fully automating all jobs, the idea is that you just work less. And this actually works pretty well.
And is everything decentralized today?
A lot of people used to think that degrowth would mean everything is decentralized, but basically the approach that emerged and what we kind of now have is this multi-scalar approach. So certain things do need to be centralized, certain things do need to be decentralized, and the challenge that we're kind of continuously working on is deciding how do we know when something works really well, when it's decentralized and happening at this distributed level? How do we know when we need something to be centralized and to have that reliability? And basically like kind of negotiating between these two things in a participatory, democratic way as much as possible.
So, and Joanna, how is this working on a bigger scale?
We had lived previously in a very competitive global economic system. And this essentially made it impossible for one country to choose what they wanted to do to take a degrowth path. Because it meant the threat of political isolation from other countries, of capital flight, and so on. And so what's been really essential is a kind of transnational solidarity that means that nations are working together to degrow, and they also degrow in their own way. So it hasn't been, in the 20th century and the early 21st century, this process of development, or what we now think of as like this kind of systemic underdevelopment of poorer countries by richer countries. This dynamic has completely changed, and it hasn't been easy, but it's definitely changed. Overdeveloped economies like Germany and other ones in the global north have degrown first, and this has created space in the kind of carbon budget that we have for other countries to choose their own path and continue developing in a way that they have chosen. And at the same time, there's been kind of strong alliances forming, and this was, allowing countries in the global north to learn from approaches in the global south. And this basically goes back to a shift kind of also happening around the 2020s, where degrowth no longer wanted to only focus on, critiquing green growth and showing how single nations could prosper without growth, but shifting the kind of research and practice agenda to voices that were at the margins of the growth economy, and trying to invite those in to kind of really, understand an agenda for degrowth that could be global and that could be adapted to different contexts, and not just be a kind of politics, for the global north by the global north.
So, degrowth was or is a movement.
Yes, you could call it a movement, kind of historically looking back. It was kind of this combination on one hand of activism on the ground as well as research that happened kind of in academic communities and was then distributed more widely. But it wasn't kind of a dominant agenda, so there weren't really political parties that had a degrowth platform, for example. What degrowth was basically a kind of tool that allowed different kind of existing movements for social and economic justice basically to kind of bring this on board and work out whether their visions for the future were kind of within the planetary boundaries, and adapt this. So there are also just a lot of movements that degrowth ended up being allied to, and the transformation that we had was not solely the result of degrowth. It was more this kind of finding connections between movements.
We need a binding legal framework for everyone that's understood in a planetary way, that's distributed so it can be locally organized, and that everyone abides to. And it also protects certain parties against other parties, and that's not the commons particularly.